A People's History of the United States, a critical review by Jack Krause. According to the brief description on the back cover, A People's History, written by Howard Zinn, attempts to present American history from the perspective of the people, that is, quote, women, factory workers, African Americans, Native Americans, working poor, and immigrant laborers, unquote. Zinn claims that history textbooks traditionally underrepresent these groups and emphasize the achievements of famous, white, usually wealthy statesmen and other figures. In writing this book, his goal involves criticizing the so-called establishment for serving the interests of a small minority of Americans and revealing the movements of the people to resist oppression and to try to improve their situation.
Because traditional histories generally deal with presidents and Congresses and Supreme Court decisions, and when you read those traditional histories, what is implied is that these are the people, these important people are the ones who decide what is to be done, and your job is to watch them, or your job is to listen to them, or your job is to vote for them, which reduces your role as a citizen to going into the polling booths every 4 years or every 2 years. And what I am saying in this book is, look, here is what ordinary people who are not presidents and who are not in Congress, here's what they were able to accomplish when the authorities were not able to. In fact, when the authorities were hostile to progress.
One of the main focuses of Zinn's approach to writing history is avoiding the portrayal of American people as sharing a unifying national interest. The intended audience is anyone, especially students, looking for an alternative version of American history. The author, at different times during his life, worked at a shipyard, flew bomber missions during World War II, received a PhD in history from Columbia University, taught at Spelman College, participated in civil rights movements, and became a professor of political science at Boston University until 1988. He wrote several plays, history books, and an autobiography. A People's History of the United States is by far his most popular and famous work, having sold more than 2 million copies. When asked about what people should take from his books, Zinn responded,
"Is the idea of being an active citizen in a country that will be made more democratic as more ordinary people take part in it." This comes from you might guess, a general distrust of authority and government, and a feeling that they very often don't do the right things, and I guess I write history about social movements and about people who are not up there on top, because I want people who read my work to get a sense of the power of powerless people once these powerless people begin to think for themselves.
The book, first published in 1980 and more recently in 2003, is organized into 25 chronological chapters, each centering on a specific group of people and period of U.S. history, from Indians affected by Columbus's discovery in 1492 to critics during the 2000 election and War on Terror. The two main concentrations of analysis are in the first chapter, in which the author states his goals in writing the book, and the 23rd chapter, in which he synthesizes his perception of American history and outlines his hope for the future. The rest of the 688-page book uses copious examples and facts to describe popular movements and to discuss the abuses of political and business authorities throughout U.S. history, with occasional commentary from Zinn. The reader will usually find at least 3 pieces of evidence in the form of anecdotes, statistics, and specific events on every page. Though Zinn argues for various claims in each chapter concerning subjects like the socio-economic reasons for black slavery and the extent to which World War II was a people's war, his underlying thesis says that people's movements of the past and their demonstration of resistance and unity can reveal new possibilities for the future. Zinn describes mass movements of the groups he considers the people very well, with, as previously stated, plenty of evidence. He chooses to focus on such people as the participants in Bacon's Rebellion, members of the Socialist Party, and workers in several labor unions, rather than presidents and famous diplomats, although he does discuss them and important federal decisions, especially after the 1950s. The second part of the thesis, the potential constructive changes in the future, is only treated in depth in the 23rd chapter, entitled The Coming Revolt of the Guards, and seems to be half prediction of dynamics in class relations based on historical analysis, half wishful personal vision based on leftist political philosophy. So, while the author's specific factual information effectively examines the subjects of his book, it doesn't always connect to his main argument. However, the reader could view the book more as a source of information to supplement traditional historical knowledge instead of a work arguing for a thesis. The primary reason one could criticize this book is its conspicuous left-wing bias, reflected by its title and content. In the previously mentioned 23rd chapter, Zinn theorizes that growing discontent in the American middle class will lead to greater class consciousness and radical changes in the system through civil disobedience, demonstrations, and similar methods of protest. He basically imagines a socialist utopia emerging in the future, which in reality is a near impossibility and merely his personal political message. Here he discusses how his background influenced his perspective.
And when I say that my life experiences made me reject the idea of objectivity, because my life experiences gave me a point of view. My life experience, well, my experience growing up in the working class family, going to work in a shipyard, and that life experience made me, I would say, class conscious, made me aware that we weren't all one big happy family in the United States. You know, despite the words of the Constitution and the preamble, we the people of the United States. No, we the people of the United States were not all of one interest. There were people who were very rich and there were people who were poor, and a lot of nervous people in between.
Zinn acknowledges his rather radical leaning. He says, the book, quote, is a history disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance. That makes it a biased account, one that leans in a certain direction. I am not troubled by that because the mountain of history books under which we all stand leans so heavily in the other direction that we need some counterforce to avoid being crushed into submission, unquote. He also points out that objectivity in historical writing is basically impossible because historians must select certain material, emphasizing some facts and omitting others, creating ideological distortion. Describing his position on objectivity, Zinn said,
the notion of objectivity never appealed to me. That is the notion that...
Objectivity as a historian.
Objectivity as a historian, or objectivity as a journalist, or, the notion that you can describe a situation and not put yourself into it, and not have your own interests and your own point of view intrude in what you decide to talk about or write about.
Perhaps Zinn deserves credit for not trying to conceal his bias or present it as necessarily correct, but as a presentation of U.S. history, his book places too much emphasis on class conflict and often excludes evidence from perspectives different from his own. Although he intends to avoid simplification, Zinn removes much of history's complexity by ignoring opposing pieces of evidence. Other points of criticism are that Zinn relies heavily on secondary sources for analysis and portrays groups or individuals in ways that simplify issues and imply judgment of them as good or bad. Zinn offers fairly sparse commentary and usually fills pages with information, forgetting to add warrants to relate facts to his claims. When interpreting documents or other kinds of evidence, he often quotes other historians. While this writing style isn't necessarily detrimental to the book's quality, the diction is always simple and uninteresting. However, some readers may prefer Zinn's easily understandable style. Zinn may find certain policies of several administrations intelligent and beneficial to the nation, but he generally disapproves of all presidents and any authorities working for the establishment. Meanwhile, he appears to admire most radical leaders and anyone committing civil disobedience. This automatic mistrust of government and faith in rebellious-minded people detracts from Zinn's credibility because, through his presentation and selection of evidence, he sometimes imposes a moral viewpoint on what should be a fair historical analysis. His argument that historians cannot write objectively may even be regarded as an excuse for writing opinionated, simplified history. Some critics argue that Zinn totally ignores facts that disprove his conclusions, such as his claim that Morton Sobel and the Rosenberg were prosecuted for espionage in 1950 with weak, unreliable evidence, though Russian archives contained conclusive evidence and Sobel later confessed in 2010. A People's History of the United States may be at least slightly outdated. The first edition was published in 1980 when the claim that conventional textbooks underrepresent major groups in American history would have been more relevant. Though Zinn's assertion remains partly true, our textbook, The American Pageant, discusses the influence of strikes and labor unions and the terrible methods of Indian removal and assimilation to make room for U.S. expansion, which are significant topics in a people's history. So far, I have described the shortcomings and criticisms of A People's History of the United States, but there are several reasons I might recommend the book. The book contains much information often avoided or only briefly discussed by government-focused historical works, such as facts concerning overseas imperialism, the Vietnam War and Gulf War, prison revolts, large strikes, socialism in America, feminist movements, and the situations of African Americans and Native Americans throughout U.S. history. In addition, Zinn uses a wide variety of primary and secondary sources in his research, though some critics have mentioned that he refrains from writing footnotes. I would only suggest that someone read this book as a supplement to other less biased works about American history, because Zinn presents only his own unique perspective rather than including others. As a historical argument, A People's History of the United States fails to persuade the reader of its weak and vaguely defined thesis. Some have questioned the validity of Howard Zinn's claims or doubted his competence as a historian. I would probably not recommend the book to anyone unless they were researching American people's movements or looking for an alternative perspective on U.S. history. However, A People's History isn't completely devoid of academic value due to its detailed descriptions of popular movements and other traditionally ignored aspects of U.S. history. Zinn makes a respectable attempt to present a new vision of American history, but his clear bias, boring diction, and quixotic theory lacking sufficient evidence prevent A People's History from achieving its full potential as an analysis of people's movements.